Afternoon, I'll call the committee to order. Today, the committee will hear testimony from the Congressional Budget Office Director, Phillip Swagel, on CBO's updated budget and economic projections. These projections account for the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and legislation enacted in response to it and provide a window into the future of our financial state. This is Dr. Schwegel's first time testifying before the Budget Committee since becoming the 10th Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Unfortunately, the pandemic has delayed us from having him appear before this committee. I'd like to thank Dr. Swagel for being here today. I'd also like to thank the CBO staff for working to provide Congress with informed estimates at a time of unprecedented uncertainty and unusual working conditions. CBO's updated budget projections confirmed what we all knew, that the economic disruption caused by COVID-19 and the federal government's response have led to a surge in deficits and debt. CBO projects that by the end of the month, we will have spent $3.3 trillion more than we took in during fiscal year 2020, more than triple the size of last year's deficit, and the largest deficit relative to the size of our economy since 1945. Our debt to GDP ratio will close out the year at 98%, nearly 20 percentage points higher than it was at the end of the last year. Next year, it's expected to climb above 100% for the first time since the end of World War II. These staggering updated figures reflect the magnitude of the crisis presented by COVID-19 and the unprecedented actions Congress and the President have taken. In response to the pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns, we came together on a bipartisan basis to enact the largest relief package in United States history. We worked to alleviate the financial devastation, and it helped, but at great cost. CBO estimates that the legislation enacted in response to the pandemic will cost roughly $2.8 trillion. Sometimes the amounts we are discussing are so great that we lose context. That $2.8 trillion is the equivalent of $8,400 for each and every adult and child in this country. Adult and child in this country, $8,400. By all accounts, the U.S. fiscal response to COVID-19 was one of the largest, if not the largest, among advanced economies. It was an extraordinary response to an extraordinary challenge. But we face another extraordinary challenge. As the CBO demonstrates, our national debt continues growing long after the current crisis abates. CBO projects that the size of our publicly held debt, which already amounts to more than $60,000 for every adult and child, will soon exceed the size of our economy. And by 2023, the debt to GDP ratio will be the highest it's been in our nation's history. It'll only keep growing from there. By 2050, debt will reach 195% of GDP. Deficit spending in the national debt was unsustainable before the pandemic. We must address it before it becomes the next historic crisis or prohibits future policymakers from dealing with future emergencies. COVID-19 and the government response to it are not the root of the cause of our long-term budget problem. Nevertheless, that does not mean we should continue to spend with impunity. While additional measures to combat the virus and help struggling families and businesses may be necessary, we cannot use this crisis to justify multi-trillion-dollar wish lists that have little or nothing to do with the pandemic. Wasting billions bailing out mismanaged pension plans or providing tax breaks to wealthy individuals in high-tax states won't help us find a vaccine or spur the economic recovery. More spending will squander our limited fiscal capacity and saddle our children and grandchildren with an even higher debt. Make no mistake, debt and deficits matter. CBO warns that our rising debt will leave future generations with higher interest rates, lower incomes, and a greater chance of a fiscal crisis, which will lead to more painful options while we try to address it. We cannot continue running trillion-dollar annual deficits forever. The longer we wait, the more severe the challenges, and challenges will be, and the fewer options we have. I look forward to hearing from our witness today, and there is no person representing the other side, so we can move on to our witness. Our witness today, as I mentioned, is Dr. Phillip Swagel, the director of the Congressional Budget Office. Dr. Swagel became the 10th director of the CBO on June 3rd, 2019. Prior to his appointment, he was a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the Milken Institute. Dr. Swagel was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury Department from 2006 to 2009, and he has also served as Chief of Staff and Senior Economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board and the International Monetary Fund. It covers just about all the financial bases. For the information of colleagues, Dr. Swagel will provide us with an opening statement, followed by questions. Dr. Swagel, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Enzi, Ranking Member Sanders, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about CBO's budget update and the long-term budget outlook. I'll focus in my remarks now on that long-term fiscal challenge, and the challenge is daunting. At the same time, the United States is not facing an immediate fiscal crisis. The current low interest rates indicate that the debt is manageable for now, and that fiscal policy could be used to address national priorities if the Congress chose to do so. In our projections, interest rates remain low for several years as the economy recovers from the effects of the pandemic, in part because the Federal Reserve is working to keep interest rates low. Now, let me make two main points about the long-term outlook. Federal debt is high and is projected to rise substantially. That's number one. Then number two is over the long term, actions are needed to address the nation's fiscal challenges. So here are some of the numbers. The federal debt held by the public is projected to increase to 98% of GDP at the end of this year. It's up from 79% last year and up from only 35% in 2007, before the start of the previous recession. And the debt is projected to continue to rise, reaching 195% of GDP by 2050, and that far exceeds the previous high of 106% recorded just after World War II. So what's happened this year in 2020? Well, the year began with a strong economy and a strong labor market, but also with a deficit that was projected at $1 trillion. It was high already by historical standards. And then, of course, Mr. Chairman, as you said, the pandemic changed the situation dramatically. So our projection of the deficit this year has increased to $3.3 trillion, mostly reflecting the budgetary effects of legislation enacted to address the pandemic and of course, the resulting economic downturn. Now, at 16% of GDP, the deficit relative to the size of the economy is the largest since 1945. Now, over the next 30 years, debt will continue to rise, and that's because federal spending is set to grow from 21% of GDP last year to 31% of GDP in 2050, and with interest costs contributing the most to that growth in spending. And again, that's even as we project interest rates to remain low for several years as the economy recovers from the pandemic, and those low interest rates hold down borrowing costs. The challenge is that continued deficits drive up the cost of servicing the debt. And spending growth also reflects rising costs for healthcare programs and for Social Security, spurred by both the aging of the population and by projected growth in healthcare costs. Federal revenues increased from 16% of GDP last year, again before the pandemic, to 19% in 2050. So the challenge with long-term fiscal policy is that the path over the coming decades is unsustainable, and the cost of financing these deficits and servicing the debt cannot consume an ever-growing proportion of the nation's income. And the consequences of this high and rising debt will play out for the economy. Borrowing costs will eventually rise, reducing business investment, slowing economic growth. The larger interest payments will go to foreign holders of US debt, and that subtracts from our national income. And then a fiscal crisis in which interest rates abruptly escalate or other disruptions occur become a greater risk. And higher rates of inflation and the chance of a loss of confidence in the dollar have a greater chance of occurring. So now, there's no set tipping point at which a fiscal crisis becomes likely or imminent, and nor is there an identifiable point at which interest costs as a percentage of GDP become unsustainable. The challenge is that as the debt grows, these risks become greater. Now, the status of the federal trust funds is one indication that action may be needed soon. So in our projections, the Highway Trust Fund is exhausted in 2021. Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund is exhausted in 2024. The Social Security's Disability Trust Fund exhausted in 2026. And the main fund of Social Security, the Old Age and Survivors Fund, is exhausted in 2031. So action is close, not over the horizon, but the fiscal challenge is close by. Again, the current low interest rates on Treasury securities indicate that the nation is not facing an immediate fiscal crisis, but we face fiscal challenges over the long term that will require difficult adjustments after we have emerged from the challenges of the pandemic. So let me conclude and just take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to thank you on behalf of everyone at CBO. Thank you and your staff for your support and for CBO and for our mission to serve the committee and the Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments and even more so your full report that I hope people will take a look at. I did note that you mentioned interest rates and confidence in the dollar, and I think they're both tied together. And I've looked at what a difference that will make. So now we'll turn to questions, and to explain the process, each member will have 5 minutes for questions. Normally we'd start with myself and then the ranking member, but Senator Grassley has been on this committee longer than I have, and could have been the chair of it several times and has a long experience with it. Of course, he's chairing the Finance Committee right now, and this is all related to that. So I'll yield my time to Senator Grassley.
Yeah, thank you for your courtesy. And Director, I'm glad to see you in your new position and have you here. During presidential elections, Democrats here in the Senate decide to manufacture some sort of crisis in Social Security. Then they use that crisis to try to scare and mislead seniors and the disabled into believing that some people want to destroy the program. And they feed those scare tactics to whoever is the Democrat nominee for president. In light of the recent executive order to allow an optional deferral of payroll taxes for employees, some Democrats wrote to the Social Security chief actuary about some sort of hypothetical legislation that they don't support. The hypothetical legislation would entirely eliminate payroll taxes that fund Social Security. So 3 questions. First, are you aware of any plan to destroy the entirely eliminate, I better start over again. Are you aware of any plan by anyone to entirely eliminate payroll taxes and destroy Social Security?
No, I'm not. And I read the SSA actuary's analysis and saw that he also said there was no plan that he was aware of either, and it was entirely hypothetical.
Okay. Second, can you tell me what effect the president's executive order to allow deferral of some payroll taxes for a few months has on the CBO's long-term outlook for Social Security trust funds?
So that EO is not in our figures, just as we closed out our books just before the president issued it, but that would have essentially no impact on the long-term budget outlook. It's deferral and not a change in the long-term budget.
Okay. Third, does CBO know that the Treasury Department will continue to, throughout the year, to make deposits in the Social Security Trust Fund associated with payrolls, even though with the optional deferral.
Yes, that's correct. The Treasury will continue to pay into the trust funds even with the deferral.
Then the last one on this subject, according to Social Security Chief Actuary, the employer payroll tax deferral in the CARES Act legislation, which enjoyed support of all Democrats and Republicans who voted, does not affect revenue in the trust funds. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Hitting Social Security from a little different angle. CBO's projections for when Social Security trust funds are exhausted are different from projection in the Social Security Trustees Report. CBO has also provided estimates for effects of reform bills that differ from estimates that Social Security Chief Actuary provides as technical assistance. As an example, Representative John Larson has a reform bill called the Social Security 2100 Act. That bill increases taxes substantially, including taxes for low-wage earners and the middle class, and it also increases Social Security benefits, with most of the extra dollars going to upper wage earners. Social Security actuary estimated that the bill would go a long ways to generate financial sustainability of Social Security. CBO had a different assessment and estimated that the bill would only postpone exhaustion of Social Security trust funds by around 9 years. CBO and Social Security actuaries and trustees also seem to have different outlooks for when Social Security trust funds will be exhausted under current law. Can you discuss the sources of some of the differences between estimates concerning Social Security programs at CBO and Social Security actuaries who provide technical assistance?
Yes, sir, I can. So we have different modeling approaches, but the main difference between our estimates and the actuaries' estimates are in the parameter choices. So the underlying numbers for fertility, for longevity, or mortality, income inequality, that have all the economic variables that affect the financial condition of the Social Security system. So we have a bit more pessimistic view, right? We have the trust fund exhausted in 2031, and before the pandemic, they had it in 2034, 2035. And just as an example, after the financial crisis, fertility, so the number of babies for each woman of childbearing age, did not rebound as much as it had in the past after past recessions. And we've marked down fertility, and that means over 75 years that it's a negative for the Social Security financing system. So that's the sort of difference that we've taken into account. This year, the trustees started to take that into account. We have some other differences on inequality, things like that as well.
Thank you, Dr. Swagel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. And let's see, Senator Scott has not had another committee meeting that he had to duck into. He will be back, but I'll go ahead and ask some questions then, and then Senator Kennedy, and followed by Senator Toomey, Senator Crapo, and now Senator Braun, in that order, depending on who's online or here. So to begin my questions, right now the interest on the federal debt are at historic lows, even negative on an inflation-adjusted basis. I've read some claim that means that debt and deficits don't matter. Is that true?
No, sir. We would say that they still matter, that the low interest rates, of course, are reducing the cost of servicing the debt, but over time, as the economy recovers, as we get past the pandemic, and as the debt rises, we expect interest rates to rise, and the cost of servicing the debt will become more challenging.
Well, CBO, you projected that interest rates will stay well below what we've seen in the past. The average rate on the 10-year Treasury note over the last 30 years was 4.5%, but CBO projections are that it'll average about 2% between 2020 and 2030. Even still, CBO projects interest spending will skyrocket in the long-term budget outlook. How would your projection budget change if interest rates were 1% higher? And what if the rates were matched their historical average over the last 30 years? That's asking for some
No,
numbers.
I understand, I understand. So I'll just start by saying we have, as I said, we have interest rates staying low as the economy recovers. By 2028, we see the economy back at our potential. So just past the lingering effects on the economy of the pandemic. Obviously, there's lots of lingering effects. And as that happens, that's when we start to see interest rates rising. So it could happen sooner, it could happen later. If it happens sooner and more, that would have a very substantial effect on debt to GDP. And so just to give the number, the example that you cited, if interest rates were 1 percentage point higher than we forecast, the debt to GDP ratio, 30 years out, would be something like 254% of GDP instead of 195% of GDP. So it makes is a really sizable difference, just 1 percentage point difference in the interest rate.
Yeah. And what has the historical average for interest rates been in the last whatever number of years?
So it's we looked at the 30-year average,
Yeah.
and that's about 4.6% for the 10-year, which, of course, it's hard to predict interest rates way out into the future, but we do have historical low interest rates right now.
And they are related to how much people have faith in what we're doing, I think. If they have less faith, they'll need more interest in order to leave their money with us. But your updated projections show that the economic downturn has strained the financials of several trust fund programs that were already in trouble. Can you discuss how the CBO's projections of Social Security, Medicare, and highway trust funds have changed and how they're already running deficits?
So the trust fund report that we released at the same time with the budget update showed that the federal trust funds that you mentioned, highway, Medicare, Social Security, disability, and the main Social Security, all have exhaustion dates sooner than we'd previously expected. And this reflects in large part, the effect of the pandemic in reducing the contributions that go into those trust funds. Each year forward, means that we have less time to address it, and that the cumulative trust fund deficit that we see over the next 10 years, so across all the trust funds, it's over $2 trillion, so it's $2.3 trillion for 10 years. That's as a whole, the trust funds, the net deficit in them over the next 10 years, just as an indication of the challenge that's really in the next decade.
I appreciate your precise answers. I do have a few more questions, but I'll turn to Senator Kennedy for his. Oh, Senator Brown, I can turn to you for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swagel, if you remember the last time we were together, I was wanting you to maybe revise what the impact was from the Tax Cut Act of 2017. I think the original amount from your office was that it would have a $150 billion per year impact, $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Is that roughly correct?
That's right.
And then notice pre-COVID that it looked like we were generating record revenues. Is that correct in terms of what it was compared to the year before? And I think maybe up somewhere in the range of 4 to 4.5%.
The revenue in dollars was certainly extremely strong. The revenue as a share of GDP was slightly below the long-term average, but set to rise up above that long-term average.
So, but the increase from the last measurable year to the year before has been over 4%, hasn't it?
Yes. We've had a strong economy, and it's reflected, as you said, in the revenue figures.
So do you still stick with that projection that over a 10-year period, now that you've had the benefit of at least a couple years, in the trend that we were on pre-COVID, I'll give you the opportunity to revise that projection if you want to.
Okay. We haven't gone back and revised that. For sure, the economy before the pandemic was strong, the labor market was strong, and that translated into revenues. The challenge is distilling, that strength of the economy, distilling out the specific effects of the 2017 Tax Act. We haven't gone back and done that. We'll continue to go back and look at that.
Well, one thing you might do is look at whatever the parameters were when you made it in the first place, and you had to use some method that was going to make that differentiation. I still would like to see that. I know COVID has put a glitch in that, but let's look at it this way. We have a structural deficit of roughly $1 trillion, COVID aside, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so 150 billion divided by $1 trillion is 15%, correct? So 85% of the structural deficit would have nothing to do with the original projection, if in fact that is still true. So it gets down to whatever we do, and looking at whoever put the chart together on easy pay-fors for Social Security and Medicare. Was that you, or was that, did you do this, Chairman?
From Manhattan Institute.
Okay, so have you looked at these? Do you believe them to be accurate?
Wait, I'm sorry, the chart. I'm
Well,
not
we'll
sure.
get you one of these. It's a different,
I know that. I can tell just by looking at it from
Yeah.
It's Brian Riedel, I think. It's his chart.
yes.
I looked at it very quickly just in the last day or two. But
And if you look at what they do over 10 years, some of them being very, very drastic, it still leaves a gap, unless you'd maybe combine a couple of them. So I think it clearly gets down to the fact that we have a spending issue more so than a revenue one. And I'm going to end up with this question, which is two-part. Do you think we've hit the sweet spot of taxation? That's something, if you can't give me an answer today, I'd love for you to get back to it. And I think that at some point we got to realize that whatever we do on the tax side of the equation, it's not going to address the fact that we don't have the political will to do something on the spending side. In general, do you think that is a fair statement?
okay. I'll cover a couple of these, if that's
Okay.
okay. I'll start by, at the end of this year, we're going to put out an option of budget, a volume of budget options. So we will not tell you, you'll never hear from me what the Congress should do, but we will give you our analysis and sort of our version of that menu, and entirely up to you to choose. At CBO, we think of it as a deficit problem and a debt problem, and not as much of a revenue problem or a spending problem, just because we shy away from saying what the Congress should adjust. But for sure, as you say, there is a deficit problem, there is a debt problem, and that action is needed. And whether the Congress does it on the spending side or the revenue side, we will provide the analysis, but action is absolutely needed.
Thank you.
You're doing an excellent job of answering questions concisely, and I appreciate it. I have a few more questions I'll do, and Senator Braun has more. We can do that too, but Dr. Swagel, you're hardly the first CBO director to warn this committee about a dire fiscal outlook. The pandemic has not created the issue. How long has CBO been warning us that the federal budget's unsustainable?
The first long-term budget outlook came out in 2000, it's October 2000, and that warned about rising costs for retirement and healthcare. and that was, of course, even as the overall budget was in surplus at the time. So at least for 20 years, we've been flagging this issue. I suspect Alice Rivlin, the founder of the agency, had it in her mind as well.
Appreciate that, because our soaring debt raises the possibility of a fiscal crisis similar to what we saw in several European countries. I got to visit Greece after that, where they impounded personal savings accounts. I have read that it's foolish to worry about a U.S. debt crisis because we aren't seeing any warning signals. CBO and most other forecasters don't anticipate particularly high interest rates or inflation anytime soon. Does that mean that we can't face a debt crisis?
No, sir. And that's the challenge, that the financial markets are not flashing those warning signs now. But the reasoning is understandable, given the effects of the pandemic and the actions of the Federal Reserve and the situation around the world, where our economy still looks like the most trustworthy in many dimensions. As the economy recovers, as the Fed normalizes its policy and does not suppress long-term interest rates, and as the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise, we worry that all the things holding down rates now will just unravel and reverse, and we'll have the problem upon us.
Thanks. My last comment and question. Congress used to be governed by an overall principle that you could pass legislation as long as it didn't add to the deficit. That was a pay-as-you-go principle. I think you'd agree that when it comes to non-emergency spending, that the pay-go principle is useful. Still, given the current forecast, is pay-go enough, or do we need to actively take steps toward deficit reduction?
I mean, the pay-go is a step, that's for sure. So I don't have negative things to say about pay-go. The challenge is that pay-go doesn't address the existing imbalance, doesn't exist the existing problem, which is already steep. And there's a sense in which pay-go actually makes it harder, because of course any offset, whether on the spending side or the revenue side, that's used to pay for the new activities is no longer available to address the existing imbalance. So in such as, as an example, reversing the 2017 Tax Act and then spending it all, right, that's pay-go, but that's in some sense the same as if the 2017 Tax Act had never happened and just spending had been raised. So that's the challenge with pay-go, the sense in which it makes things harder.
Well, we have another tactic that we use, which is to borrow future revenue and spend it immediately. And that isn't pay-go either. We did a national parks bill to cover deferred maintenance here earlier in the year, and people lauded it, and it's a good idea to try and cover that, but I had some suggestions in there for ways that we could actually raise the money. It would have been additional revenue, and most of it would have come from foreign visitors, but couldn't even get the amendment up. Kind of in closing, I'll mention that I talked to an inventor. The United States inventor's name is Dean Kamen. He did the segways that you see policemen riding around on, and he even invented a wheelchair that would go up and down stairs, but that was after 200 medical patents that he did. Then he got to play with these other things. So he does a lot of thinking, and he got a hold of me about the pandemic things that we were doing and said, you're actually spending some of that Social Security money and you're giving out money in the pandemic checks, and why don't you get the people that are receiving that money to sign that they will take a deferral on receiving their Social Security and allow for means testing? Said particularly young people would probably sign that, and that would help to overcome the deficit. And I'm out of my time here, but I see that Senator Van Hollen is here, and I would give him an opportunity for questions before we close if he wishes. Senator Van Hollen.
Good to have you with us. I hadn't planned to address this, but since Senator Grassley raised the issue of a letter a number of us sent to the Social Security actuary, I thought I would address it. And while we indicate in our letter that we were discussing a hypothetical proposal, the reality is that Donald Trump did say, and I'm quoting here, and the payroll tax will be terminating the payroll tax after I hopefully get elected. He went on to elaborate on that. So it was appropriate that we asked the actuary what the impact of that would be on Social Security. And I'm sure if you ask folks at the White House whether that's what President Trump meant to say, they will say it's not. But we've also learned that the only person who counts in this White House is the president himself, which is appropriate, and that's what he did say. With respect to PAYGO, I would just point out that when the big tax cuts were passed in 2017 that disproportionately went to the wealthiest Americans, as part of that, our Republican colleagues waived the PAYGO rule, as well as the law, the statutory PAYGO, because otherwise the statutory PAYGO rule, as well as the law, would have constrained that tax cut and would not have allowed another $2 trillion to be added to the deficit. We are now in the middle of this pandemic right now, and the CARES Act, of course, put forward a number of ways to address it, and I think that bipartisan effort did help rescue many families and small businesses. Interestingly, in your report, at Table 3, you assess the relative benefits of those different approaches. And as I see this, you say that aid to state and local governments is among the most efficient forms of economic stimulus that was passed by Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
I mention that because the HEROES Act that passed the House, I think almost 5 months ago now, contains substantial support for state and local governments who are struggling and will otherwise have to lay off workers, whereas the proposal put forward here in the Senate by Senator McConnell had zero additional funds for state and local governments. So it's interesting to me that that has been determined to be one of the most effective things that we can do going forward. Similarly, I see under your revenue provisions, and I know it's a mix of them, but collectively you find that some of the tax cut provisions are among the least effective in terms of dollars spent per economic growth gained. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And as you said, the state and local money is especially effective in in terms of the change in the deficit. How much GDP does that add? It means that states and local governments don't have to raise taxes or cut other spending by as much as they might have to, and that's why we get that result. The tax provisions do have a positive impact on GDP, but not as you said, not as large as the state and local money.
Right. We're talking per dollar spent, and we've had conversations in this committee about how we can most efficiently spend, for example, our housing dollars. But what your report shows is that a state and local government expenditures, the spending on help for them, is a lot more efficient per federal dollar spent than the tax expenditures taken together. Is that right?
That's right. That's what our report finds for the money that's been enacted so far.
Yeah. And I just, in terms of the public health issue, you have a paragraph here talking about how one of the fastest ways to speed up economic growth and regain ground is to deal with the public health issues, which makes common sense. The more comfortable people are going out about a business and can normalize their activities, the sooner we'll get back to that. And you point out that we could reduce the scale of social distancing needed to slow the spread of the virus with more widespread use of masks, greater testing, and increased contact tracing. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And that social distancing would have an effect on the economy and also on the effectiveness of policy. That if Congress puts more money, into fiscal policy, with less social distancing, the sorts of interventions you mentioned, that money would be more effective. People would be able to spend more and more rapidly.
Sure. The more comfortable people feel by applying those measures that have been advocated by the public health experts, the sooner we'll get our economy going. I will have some questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Director.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to ask some more, you may. I'll call on Senator Braun for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the modeling that you use to come up with predictions on what raising, lowering taxes would do, I'm assuming it's a dynamic system that does reflect that when you raise taxes, it generally, as a rule, is going to depress economic growth. Do your models incorporate that?
Yes, they do. And we look at the details of the tax. So a higher tax on capital, for example, would mean a lower return to investment. We'd have less investment, we'd have less saving. That would affect the capital stock. Similarly, a higher tax on wage income would affect people's willingness to work, and that would affect the economy as well.
Well, that's good. I figured the case, and it's leading to a second question, and I'll be interested to see if you differentiate between the two kinds of personal income. Before the Tax Act of 2017, I think the highest marginal rate was 39.6%. And I think that was applied to W-2 and 1099 income as well as K-1 income. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And to me, those are two different kinds of income taxed at the same rate. One is as liquid as you can get, W-2 and 1099. K-1, on the other hand, which is called business income, flow-through income, is inherently illiquid. Do you differentiate between the two kinds of personal income? Because the rates got separated in the Tax Act of 2017. Is that reflected in your models in terms of what it would do lowering the 1099 W-2 rate versus the K-1 rate?
Yes, that we would take that into account in our modeling, and we'd also take into account the difference between the pass-through rate and the corporate rate in shifting the incentives for a business to decide whether to incorporate or remain a pass-through. We all of those.
So has your modeling since then reflected the benefit of basically keeping the 1099 W-2 rate, I think it's at 37 now versus 39.6. Have you been able to measure the benefits into the strong economy that you cited earlier, which anecdotally and theoretically, I would say has been the driver of the recent prosperity pre-COVID? And whenever you're talking about taxing the wealthy, to me, that's a liquid income. Most small businesses, whether you're a proprietorship, a partnership, a sub-S, an LLC, you are going to have the K-1 type income. So sounds like your modeling reflects that, and that's good to know, and I personally think that's been the driver behind how well the economy has done. And I cite the corporate rate to where I think nominally it was, 35% prior, 21 now, and my understanding the effective rate was as low as 18% when the nominal rate was 35. Is that your understanding, or do you have a different figure on that?
I don't have the figure off the top of my head.
I think it's somewhere in that neighborhood, and even though the nominal rate has fallen to 21, the effective rate has only fallen to 16. That shows you how much our tax code is littered with write-offs that benefit just some. Final question would be, when it comes to, and you mentioned it earlier, we're paying almost a zero interest rate when you take into account inflation. Is that due to the fact that we're basically the only reserve currency, that others are willing to lend us money of a different currency, knowing that it generally will stay put and not depreciate? Is that part of why we're borrowing money so cheaply currently?
It is, and it's in some sense an extraordinary privilege, is the way economists look at that the U.S. has this special position in the global economy.
And is there a risk that if there would become another reserve currency, you could see interest rates spike pretty quickly? I think the euro might have been headed there before they cropped up with Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy, to name a few. Is that a risk?
That would be the risk, that since the U.S. loses its special place, sure, we could coexist with another currency, but if people lose trust in our economy, in our fiscal system, financial system, the effects could be quite rapid.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just mention one more thing just on this line, on the data that we've the 2018 tax data has only recently become available, and so we're starting to work with that. And of course, that will show the effect of the 2017 tax cut, the initial effect. So we will work with we are working with that. We work on that for distribution, but we'll also work on that for the tax policy work that I know you're very focused on. So we will have more to say on this, and we will be happy to talk more.
Senator Van Hollen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Director, I just wanted to ask you about something that Secretary Mnuchin said on national television earlier this month. Quote, "I think before we got into COVID, I thought the debt was very manageable. We were having extraordinary growth. We were creating growth that would pay down the debt over time," unquote. So this question relates to the factual accuracy of that statement and the issue of economic growth and debt. I would first point out that in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, before the pandemic hit, average economic growth was 2.5%, 2.5% over those 3 years. Whereas in the last term of the Obama administration, it was 2.4%, 0.1%. I often hear my Republican colleagues describe the Obama administration years as no growth, negative growth, and the Trump years as supercharged growth. Well, that just isn't the case. So the facts don't show that. My question to you relates to this statement where he said we were creating growth that would pay down the debt over time. So a couple factual questions. First, in 2018 and 2019, before the coronavirus pandemic, was our national debt increasing or decreasing?
The national debt before the pandemic was still increasing. Absolutely.
That's right. In fact, as I look at your report and the numbers, it appears that the debt held by the public as a share of GDP was 70% in 2017, 77.4% in 2018, and 79.2% in 2019. Is that what your report shows?
Yes, sir. That's right.
Right. So clearly, despite what the secretary said, the debt was going up. The growth was not sufficient to be reducing the debt. Second, in CBO's January 2020 budget projections, which you published before the coronavirus pandemic hit in the United States, did CBO project that our national debt would increase or decrease over time?
Right. So we had the debt trajectory continuing to increase, and such as the $1 trillion deficit we projected before the pandemic was extremely high by historical standards, even as the economy was growing and the labor market was strong before the pandemic.
Right. So I appreciate that. So it's just not factually correct that we were creating growth that would pay down the debt over time, is it?
That's right. We did not expect the pre-pandemic economic situation to lead to paying down the debt.
Right. And now, of course, we have an even bigger hole to dig out of. Is that right?
That's right.
Although if we were not taking action and to compensate for all the people who are out of work and the small businesses, the hole might get even bigger. Isn't that right?
I mean, certainly the economic situation would be much more difficult without the actions taken by the Congress, helping families, businesses, schools, children, a wide variety. Absolutely. The economic situation and the social situation would be much more difficult.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks for participating in the hearing. And of course, we had the housing hearing last week, and there was appeared to be a lot of agreement on what could be done. Of course, the devil's always in the details, but that was one of the first positive hearings that I've been to in a long time. I want to thank Dr. Swagel for his appearance before the Budget Committee today, for the work that he and all of his people have done to provide us with this information, which is quickly changing information. As for the information for all the senators, questions for the record are due by 12 p.m. tomorrow. Emailed copies of the questions are acceptable due to the current conditions. Under our rules, Dr. Swagel will have 7 days from the receipt of our questions to respond with answers. With no further business to come before the committee, the hearing is adjourned.